A waitress treated the Mafia boss's wound hours. Later, he ordered, "Bring me that woman. Find her," Colton rasped, his voice a gravelly whisper barely audible over the hum of the heart monitor. He pressed a blood-stained hand against the pristine white bandages wrapped tightly around his torso. His dark, feverish eyes locked onto his lieutenant standing at the foot of the hospital bed. "Sir, we need to focus on retaliation." "The families are," I said, "find her." Colton's voice cracked like a whip in the sterile room, demanding absolute silence. He closed his eyes, the memory of rain, neon lights, and trembling hands flashing in his mind. The waitress from the diner on 4th Street. "Bring me that woman. Do not frighten her. Do not hurt her. Just bring her to me." The neon sign outside Pete's all-night diner buzzed with a rhythmic, dying hum. The N in open had flickered out 3 months ago, leaving a desperate, sputtering Opa to beckon the insomniacs and third-shift workers of the city. Inside, Eva leaned against the scuffed Formica counter, a damp rag hanging idly from her right hand. The clock above the pie case read 2:14 a.m. The rain outside was torrential, a relentless drumming against the grease-stained windows that distorted the streetlights into blurred smears of amber and crimson. It was the kind of night that swallowed sound and swallowed people. A night where the city seemed to hold its breath. Eva sighed, pushing a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. Her uniform, a pale blue dress that had seen entirely too many bleach cycles, felt heavy against her skin. She was exhausted, between her double shifts at the diner and her grueling nursing classes during the day. Sleep was a luxury she rarely afforded. She poured herself a lukewarm cup of coffee, the bitter liquid burning pleasantly on its way down, grounding her in the quiet monotony of the diner. The only other patron was a truck driver asleep in the corner booth, a half-eaten plate of cold fries resting near his elbow. Then, the bell above the door chimed a sharp, cheerful sound that violently contradicted the sudden, heavy thud that followed. Eva jumped, her coffee sloshing over the rim of the mug and burning her knuckles. She whipped her head toward the entrance. A man was slumped against the glass door, his breathing shallow and erratic. He was dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place in Pete's, but the fabric was torn, soaked, and clinging to his frame. It took Eva a terrifying second to realize that the dark sheen reflecting the diner's fluorescent lights wasn't just rainwater. It was blood, a staggering amount of it. He took one agonizing step forward, his polished leather shoe squeaking against the cheap linoleum. And then his legs gave out entirely. He collapsed to the floor with a sickening thud, a groan escaping his lips as he rolled onto his back. "Hey!" Eva yelled, slamming her mug onto the counter. Her exhaustion evaporated instantly, replaced by the icy, hyper-focused adrenaline drilled into her during her clinical rotations. She vaulted over the counter, her worn sneakers sliding slightly on the wet floor before she dropped to her knees beside him. The man was striking, even beneath the mask of pain and grime. Sharp jawline, dark hair plastered to his forehead by the rain, and eyes that were tightly shut in agony. But Eva's focus immediately dropped to his side. His hands, adorned with a heavy, silver signet ring, were desperately clutching his lower abdomen. Blood was pooling beneath him, stark and horrifying against the faded black and white checkered tiles. "Sir, can you hear me?" "Look at me," Eva demanded, her voice firm, stripping away the gentle waitress persona and slipping seamlessly into the authoritative tone of a first responder. She grabbed his wrists, pulling his hands away from the wound. His eyes snapped open. They were a piercing, bottomless brown, clouded with pain but instantly sharp with suspicion. He grabbed her wrist with surprising strength, his grip like a vice. "No cops," he gasped out, his voice barely a rasp. "No hospitals. You're bleeding out," Eva shot back, trying to pry his fingers off her wrist. "You need a surgeon." "I said no hospitals," he repeated, his grip tightening until her bones ached. "Fix it, or let me die." Eva stared at him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The logic in her brain screamed to call 911, to run away, to leave this dangerous man to his fate. But the instinct in her hands, the desperate, ingrained need to preserve life, overrode her fear. She looked at the wound. It was a clean slice, likely a knife, deep and dangerously close to major arteries. "I need towels," she muttered to herself, tearing her wrist from his grasp. She scrambled to her feet, sprinting behind the counter and grabbing an armful of clean dish towels. She raided the first aid kit mounted on the wall, grabbing gauze, medical tape, and a bottle of rubbing alcohol. It was woefully inadequate, a pathetic arsenal against the grim reaper standing over him. But it was all she had. She slid back to his side, tearing his expensive silk shirt open without hesitation. The man winced, his jaw clenching, but he didn't stop her. "This is going to burn like hell," Eva warned, uncapping the rubbing alcohol. "Do it," he gritted out. She poured the antiseptic directly over the laceration. The man let out a guttural, strangled roar, his back arching off the floor. His hands formed fists so tight his knuckles turned white. Eva didn't hesitate. She balled up the dish towels and pressed them ruthlessly into the wound, throwing her entire body weight behind her hands to apply maximum pressure. "Keep breathing," she ordered, her face inches from his. She could smell the rain on him, mixed with expensive cologne and the sharp, metallic tang of blood. "Don't pass out on me. What's your name?" "Colton," he breathed, his eyes locking onto hers. Despite the agony, his gaze was unnervingly steady. It felt less like he was looking at her, and more like he was seeing right through her. "Okay, Colton, I'm Eva. You're going to stay awake. Do you understand me?" She held the pressure, counting the grueling seconds in her head, watching the color slowly drain from his face. She knelt there on the cold, hard floor for what felt like hours, her hands stained crimson. The diner silent except for his ragged breathing and the relentless rain outside. She didn't know who this man was, but as she pressed her weight into his side to keep his life from slipping away on Pete's linoleum, she tied her fate to his in a way neither of them could foresee. The smell of bleach couldn't entirely mask the phantom scent of copper that lingered in Eva's nostrils. It was 3 p.m. the following afternoon. Eva stood in her tiny, cramped apartment, staring blankly at the rusted pipes beneath her bathroom sink. Her hands were clean, scrubbed raw with a wire brush and harsh soap, but she still felt the slick, terrifying warmth of Colton's blood on her skin. After she had managed to stop the bleeding in the diner, 2 men in identical black suits had materialized out of the rain, their arrival as silent and sudden as ghosts. They hadn't spoken to her. They had simply scooped Colton off the floor, their faces stony and impassive, and carried him out into the night, leaving a stack of $100 bills on the counter to cover the mess. Eva had spent the rest of the night scrubbing the checkered floor until her knees bled, terrified that the police would walk in, terrified that the men would return to eliminate the only witness. She hadn't slept. She had skipped her morning anatomy lecture, citing a sudden migraine. Every shadow in her apartment felt like a threat. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps. A sharp, authoritative knock on her apartment door shattered the heavy silence. Eva froze, her breath hitched in her throat. She slowly backed away from the bathroom, her eyes fixed on the peeling paint of her front door. The knock came again. Not frantic, not angry, just precise. 3 solid raps. She crept toward the peephole and pressed her eye against the glass. The hallway was dimly lit, but she could clearly see 2 men standing outside. They were wearing immaculate black suits. One of them had a distinct, jagged scar running through his left eyebrow. They were the men from the alley. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked through her chest. She looked around wildly for a weapon, her eyes landing on a heavy brass lamp on her nightstand. She grabbed it, her knuckles white, and backed away from the door. "Miss Ava," a voice called through the wood. It was calm, almost polite. "Please open the door. We mean you no harm." She didn't answer. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying they would just go away. "Miss Eva, we know you are in there. Our employer has requested your presence. It is a matter of urgency, and he explicitly instructed us to treat you with the utmost respect. But we will not leave without you." The quiet certainty in the man's voice was more terrifying than a shouted threat. It was the sound of inevitability. Ava realized with a sinking feeling that a flimsy wooden door and a brass lamp were not going to protect her from men who dealt in blood and shadows. Trembling, she set the lamp down. She walked to the door, her hand hovering over the deadbolt. With a deep, shuddering breath, she unlocked it and pulled it open. The scarred man gave a short, crisp nod. "Thank you. Please, come with us." "Where?" Eva asked, her voice cracking. "Where are you taking me? Is Colton dead?" "He is alive thanks to you," the man replied smoothly. "And he wishes to see you. A car is waiting." They didn't give her time to pack a bag or change out of her oversized sweater and jeans. They escorted her down the stairs with professional efficiency, flanking her like silent sentinels. Outside, a sleek, heavily tinted black SUV idled at the curb. The scarred man opened the rear door, gesturing for her to step inside. The interior of the SUV smelled of rich leather and ozone. As the door slammed shut behind her, sealing her in the quiet, climate-controlled cabin, Eva felt a profound sense of isolation. The city blurred past the tinted windows, transitioning from the grimy, crowded streets of her neighborhood to wide, manicured boulevards lined with towering oak trees. She sat rigidly in the back seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to control her racing heart. She knew who Colton was now, even if she didn't know his last name. The way these men moved, the sheer, quiet power radiating from the vehicle, he wasn't just a criminal. He was someone who commanded empires. And she, a broke nursing student who smelled like diner grease and cheap soap, was being delivered directly to his doorstep. The SUV eventually turned down a private, winding road bordered by high stone walls. Massive wrought iron gates swung open automatically, revealing a sprawling, opulent estate that looked more like a fortress than a home. The vehicle glided up a circular driveway, coming to a smooth stop in front of a pair of towering mahogany doors. The door opened, and the scarred man offered his hand. "We are here, Miss Eva." Eva stepped out, her worn sneakers sinking into the pristine, crushed gravel. She looked up at the towering stone facade of the mansion, feeling incredibly small. Whatever life she had known before last night was gone. As she walked up the sweeping stone steps and entered the cavernous, softly lit foyer, she knew she was stepping into a world from which she might never return. She had saved the devil's life, and now the devil had called her home. The interior of the estate was a study in intimidating wealth. Dark mahogany paneling, soaring ceilings with intricate crown molding, and floors of polished marble that echoed softly beneath Eva's sneakers. The air was cool and smelled faintly of wood smoke and expensive citrus. It was beautiful, but it felt entirely devoid of warmth. It felt like a museum, or a mausoleum. The scarred man, who had introduced himself simply as Marcus, led her down a long, dimly lit corridor. At the very end were double doors, made of heavy carved oak. Marcus knocked once, pushed the doors open, and stepped aside, gesturing for Eva to enter. She walked into a vast, shadow-draped study. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books, and a massive marble fireplace dominated the far wall, a low fire crackling in the grate. Behind a heavy, antique walnut desk sat Colton. He looked different than he had on the floor of the diner. He was pale, his cheekbones sharp and hollowed, and he wore a dark silk robe draped loosely over his broad shoulders. The heavy bandages wrapping his torso were visible at his chest. Despite the pallor of his skin and the obvious pain etched around his eyes, the aura of authority radiating from him was palpable. He was a predator, temporarily wounded, but still completely in control of his territory. Colton looked up as she entered, his dark eyes locked onto hers, analyzing, assessing. He gestured to a plush leather chair opposite his desk. "Sit." Eva didn't move immediately. She stood her ground, her chin tilted up slightly despite the trembling in her hands. "Why am I here? You're alive. My job is done. I didn't call the police. You have no reason to threaten me." A faint, humorless smile touched Colton's lips. "If I wanted to threaten you, Eva, you wouldn't be standing in my study. Please, sit." Reluctantly, Eva crossed the room and sat on the edge of the leather chair, keeping her posture stiff and alert. "You have a remarkable way of applying pressure," Colton said, leaning back slightly, though the movement caused a subtle wince. "The doctor who eventually stitched me up said I would have bled out in 3 minutes if you hadn't intervened. You saved my life." "I did what anyone would do," Eva said quietly. "No," Colton countered softly. "Most people would have run. Most people would have screamed. You ripped my shirt open, poured fire into my side, and looked me dead in the eye while doing it. You have training." "I'm a nursing student," she admitted, seeing no point in lying. "I've done clinical rotations in the ER." Colton nodded slowly, as if confirming a piece of a puzzle. "I require your services, Eva." Eva blinked, taken aback. "My services? You have money. You can hire the best private doctors in the world. You have men in suits who can build you a hospital in your basement. I have doctors on the payroll." "Yes," Colton agreed, his voice turning colder. a sharp edge entering his tone. But the man who put this knife in me was supposed to be one of my most trusted lieutenants. Right now, I don't know who in my organization I can trust. If word gets out that I am severely wounded, there will be a war in the streets by morning. My private doctors are monitored. Bringing them here signals weakness. He leaned forward, his eyes burning with an intense, calculated heat. You are an unknown variable. You have no ties to my world. No one is watching you. You are invisible to my enemies, and you have already proven that you can handle blood and high stress without breaking. You want me to be your nurse, Eva stated. The absurdity of the situation finally settling over her. You kidnapped me to change your bandages. I didn't kidnap you, Colton corrected smoothly. I sent a car, and it is a job offer. 2 weeks. You stay here in the East Wing. You monitor my wound, administer my antibiotics, and ensure I don't develop an infection. In return, I will pay off your entire nursing school tuition, clear any debt you possess, and give you $50,000 in cash when you leave. Eva stared at him, her breath catching. $50,000. It was an impossible sum. It was freedom from the crushing debt that kept her awake at night, freedom from the diner, freedom to actually live. But it came at the cost of tying herself to a criminal empire. And if I say no? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Colton held her gaze for a long, silent moment. The crackle of the fire was the only sound in the room. I told you. I am not here to threaten you. If you say no, Marcus will drive you back to your apartment. You will never see me again. But I am asking you to stay, Ava. I am asking for your help. There was a vulnerability in his eyes just then. A fleeting shadow beneath the ruthless exterior of the Mafia boss. He was a powerful man. But in this moment, in this room, he was cornered and bleeding. Eva looked at the bandages on his chest, then back at his face. The logical part of her brain screamed at her to walk out the door, but the nurse in her saw a patient in need. And the desperate girl inside her saw a lifeline. 2 weeks, Eva said slowly, her voice solidifying. No questions about your business. I stay in my room when I'm not treating you, and I want the money in a duffel bag the day I leave. Colton's tense shoulders relaxed imperceptibly. Agreed. Then let me see the stitches, Eva said, standing up and crossing the space between them. The negotiation was over. The dynamic had shifted. In this house, he was the boss, but in matters of his survival, she was now in charge. The routine established itself with surprising speed. Eva was given a vast, opulent suite in the east wing of the estate, complete with a marble bathroom and a balcony overlooking a manicured courtyard. It was more luxurious than anything she had ever experienced. Yet she felt the heavy weight of the gilded cage every time she looked at the locked heavy oak doors at the end of her hallway. Her days were structured around Colton's needs. 3 times a day, she walked to his private study or his bedroom to check his vitals, change his dressings, and administer his IV antibiotics. The wound was severe, a deep, jagged laceration that required meticulous care to prevent sepsis. At first, their interactions were purely clinical and wrapped in heavy silence. Colton would sit stoically on the edge of his bed, his jaw clenched as Eva carefully peeled away the tape and cleaned the angry red skin around the sutures. He was a difficult patient, stubborn and prone to ignoring her instructions to rest, often spending hours pacing his study while barking orders in hushed tones into burner phones. But as the days bled into the first week, the silence between them began to fracture. The physical proximity, the intimate act of healing, forced a strange vulnerability between them. You're pressing too hard, Colton grunted one evening, flinching slightly as Eva swabbed the edge of the wound. The study was dark, lit only by the amber glow of a desk lamp. I'm pressing exactly as hard as I need to, Eva replied without missing a beat, not looking up from her task. If you stopped pacing around and aggravating the tissue, it wouldn't be so tender. Colton looked down at her. Eva was focused intently on his side, her dark hair falling softly around her face. You don't back down much, do you? Not even from me. I'm not on your payroll, Colton. I don't have to be afraid of you, she said, securing a fresh gauze pad. She finally looked up, meeting his gaze. Besides, fear makes the hands shake. You don't want a shaking nurse. A low chuckle vibrated in Colton's chest, a sound that seemed rare in this cavernous house. No, I suppose I don't. He leaned back against the headboard, his eyes tracking her as she packed away the medical supplies. Why nursing? Why not a doctor? Why not something entirely different? Eva paused, zipping the medical bag. It was the first personal question he had asked her. She debated ignoring it, keeping the professional distance intact, but the isolation of the estate was wearing on her. My younger brother was sick when we were kids, she said quietly, her eyes focused on the zipper. Leukemia. We spent a lot of time in hospitals. The doctors were brilliant, but they were in and out. It was the nurses who stayed. They were the ones who held his hand, who explained things to my mother when she was crying, who made him laugh when he was terrified. I wanted to be that for someone. Colton remained silent for a long time. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen. Did he make it? He finally asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. No, Eva whispered. She swallowed hard, pushing down the familiar, old ache. He died when he was 9. She picked up the bag, ready to retreat to her wing. But Colton's hand shot out, gently catching her wrist. It wasn't the bone-crushing grip from the diner. It was light, hesitant. I'm sorry, Eva, he said. And to her shock, he sounded genuinely, profoundly sincere. There was a raw empathy in his dark eyes that entirely contradicted the ruthless mob boss persona. It was a long time ago, she murmured, pulling her wrist away gently. Pain doesn't care about time, Colton replied, looking away toward the fire. It just learns how to hide better. Over the next few days, Eva began to notice the inconsistencies in the house. She saw the scarred man, Marcus, coordinating deliveries, but the manifests she accidentally glimpsed on a hall table weren't for weapons or illicit goods. They were for industrial water purifiers, crates of high-grade antibiotics, and bulk textiles. She noticed that Colton's phone calls, the ones he thought she couldn't hear when she approached the study, were rarely angry. They were tense, desperate. He was arguing about routes and safe houses and getting the kids out before the border closure. The monster she thought she was treating was slowly fracturing, revealing a man burdened by an immense, unseen weight. The terrifying Mafia boss was beginning to look more like a general fighting a losing war. Eva realized, with a creeping sense of unease and curiosity, that she didn't know the first thing about the man whose life she was holding in her hands. She was determined to find out exactly what kind of war Colton was fighting from the shadows of his estate. It was day 9 of her containment. The fever had finally broken, and Colton's wound was showing healthy signs of granulation. Eva felt a strange, conflicting sense of relief and dread. The closer he got to healing, the closer she got to leaving. She should have been ecstatic. Instead, a hollow ache had settled in her chest at the thought of returning to the gray reality of her life, leaving the complex, shadowed world of the estate behind. That afternoon, Eva went to Colton's study to retrieve the blood pressure cuff she had left behind earlier. The study was empty. Colton was reportedly in the basement with Marcus, conducting a meeting that Eva knew better than to inquire about. She walked over to the heavy walnut desk to grab the cuff. As she reached for it, her sleeve caught the edge of a stack of files, sending them cascading to the floor. Damn it, she muttered, dropping to her knees to gather the scattered papers. As she stacked the manila folders, a small, heavy object slid out from between the pages of a ledger and hit the marble floor with a sharp clink. Eva paused. It was a silver locket, tarnished and old, the chain broken. It had fallen open upon impact. Eva hesitated, knowing she was crossing a line. But her curiosity overpowered her caution. She picked it up. Inside the locket was a small, faded photograph of a young girl with bright, laughing eyes and dark hair tied in messy pigtails. She looked no older than 7. Beneath the locket lay the document it had fallen from. It wasn't a ledger of extortion or gambling debts. It was a dossier. Eva's eyes scanned the text. Her breath hitched. The document detailed a massive, deeply entrenched human trafficking syndicate operating along the coast. But it wasn't a business plan. It was an intelligence report, pages of intercepted communications, shipping container numbers, and photographs of holding facilities. Stamped across the top in red ink was the word, targets. She flipped frantically through the rest of the spilled files. They were all similar: blueprints of warehouses used for smuggling, profiles of corrupt border officials, ledgers tracking the financial flow of the trafficking ring not to profit from it, but to disrupt it. There were receipts for massive anonymous donations to women's shelters, orphanages, and refugee rescue operations. Colton wasn't running a criminal empire to build wealth. He was running a shadow war against monsters far worse than anyone believed him to be. Her name was Maya. Eva gasped, dropping the files and spinning around. Colton was standing in the doorway, leaning heavily on a cane, his face pale and unreadable. He wore a dark sweater, but she could see the tension radiating through his frame. He didn't look angry that she was looking at his private documents. He looked profoundly exhausted. Eva scrambled to her feet, clutching the locket in her hand. "I'm sorry. I knocked the files over. I wasn't snooping. She trailed off, looking down at the picture of the little girl, then back up to the feared Mafia boss. "Who is she?" Colton slowly walked into the room, every step deliberate and painful. He moved to the desk and held out his hand. Eva gently placed the locket into his palm. His thumb brushed over the faded photograph with a tenderness that broke Eva's heart. "She was my little sister," Colton said, his voice a hollow rasp. He snapped the locket shut, the click echoing loudly in the quiet study. "She was taken 20 years ago. We were playing in the park. I turned my back for 30 seconds to grab a ball that rolled into the street. When I turned back, she was gone. The police did nothing. They said she probably ran away." A 7-year-old. He looked up at Eva, his dark eyes shimmering with a grief that had calcified into cold, hard rage over decades. "I spent my life looking for her. I climbed into the absolute worst gutters of this city. I did things, unforgivable things, to gain power, to get access to the people who knew the truth. When I finally found the men responsible, I learned it wasn't just Maya. It was an entire industry, thousands of people, treated like cargo." Eva stared at him, the pieces violently clicking into place. "You're not a mob boss. You built an empire to tear theirs down. To fight a monster, you have to become one," Colton said bitterly, leaning on his cane. "The authorities were bought and paid for. The only way to dismantle a syndicate of that magnitude was from the inside. I took over the rival territories, consolidated power, and choked off their supply lines. The man who stabbed me last week? He was my lieutenant. He found out I was sinking our profits into destroying the trafficking rings instead of expanding our narcotics trade. He sold me out to them." Eva felt tears prick her eyes. The terrifying man in the suit, the ruthless criminal she thought she was harboring, was an illusion. He was a man who had sacrificed his own soul to build a shield for the defenseless. He had painted himself as the villain so he could have the power to hunt the real demons. "Why didn't you tell me?" Eva whispered, stepping closer to him. "Because you are innocent, Eva," Colton said, looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "And innocence is a liability in my world. The less you knew, the safer you were." Before Eva could respond, a deafening explosion shattered the quiet of the estate, rattling the windows and vibrating through the marble floor. The alarms immediately began shrieking, a piercing, high-pitched wail that tore through the air. Colton's head snapped toward the door, the vulnerability vanishing instantly, replaced by the lethal focus of a predator. "They found me." The study doors flew open, and Marcus sprinted in, an assault rifle already gripped tightly against his shoulder. A deep gash across his forehead was bleeding freely, painting half his face crimson. "They breached the outer gate!" Marcus shouted over the wail of the alarms. "Heavy ordnance. At least 30 men. It's the syndicate, boss. They know you're weak." Colton didn't hesitate. He dropped the cane, ignoring the agonizing pull on his healing abdomen, and pulled a heavy Glock from the holster strapped beneath his sweater. "Lock down the main hall. Fall back to the central corridor. We hold them at the choke point." He turned to Eva, his eyes burning with frantic urgency. "Come here, now." Eva was frozen, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs as the sound of automatic gunfire erupted from the floor below. The reality of her situation came crashing down. This wasn't a movie. This was real, and men were dying downstairs. Colton grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not painful, and dragged her toward the large bookshelf behind the desk. He reached under the edge of the mahogany trim and pressed a hidden button. With a heavy, mechanical groan, the massive bookshelf swung outward, revealing a dark, narrow passageway. "Get in," he ordered, pushing her gently into the darkness. "What about you?" Eva cried, grabbing his sweater. "Your wound, if you tear those stitches." You will bleed out before they even get to you. I have to buy time for my men to fall back, Colton said, his jaw set in a rigid line of determination. This is a reinforced panic room. It has communications, medical supplies, and ventilation. You lock the door behind me, and you do not open it for anyone but me or Marcus. Do you understand? Colton. No. Do you understand? He roared, the sheer force of his command cutting through her panic. Yes, she choked out, tears spilling down her cheeks. He looked at her for a split second, his expression softening just a fraction. He reached up and brushed a stray tear from her cheek with his thumb. I am going to get you out of here, Eva. I promise you that. He stepped back and slammed the heavy bookshelf shut. Eva was plunged into pitch blackness. A moment later, emergency red lighting flickered on, casting an eerie, bloody glow over the small, concrete-lined room. She heard the heavy, metallic clank of the deadbolts engaging automatically. She was safe, but she was entirely alone. Outside the thick walls, the sounds of war escalated. The muffled thud of explosives, the relentless staccato of automatic fire, and the faint, terrifying sounds of men shouting. Eva paced the small room like a caged animal. She found the medical kit on the wall, dragging it down and opening it. She laid out bandages, tourniquets, and hemostatic agents with trembling hands. She needed to be ready. She knew, with a sickening certainty, that if Colton survived, he was going to be broken, time distorted. Minutes felt like hours. The gunfire would surge into a deafening roar, then die down to isolated, terrifying pops, only to surge again. Eva sat on the cold concrete floor, her knees pulled to her chest, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to since her brother died. She wasn't praying for herself. She was praying for the man who had disguised himself as a monster to save the world. Suddenly, a massive, thunderous boom shook the entire foundation of the house. Dust and concrete powder rained down from the ceiling of the panic room. Then, silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that was worse than the gunfire. Eva scrambled to her feet, pressing her ear against the cold steel of the hidden door. Nothing. No voices. No footsteps. Just the distant, muffled wail of the security alarms. Then, she heard it. A slow, wet scratching sound against the outside of the door. Someone was dragging themselves along the floor. Eva's breath caught in her throat. She backed away from the door. Was it the syndicate? Had they breached the inner sanctum? A heavy, metallic thud hit the door, followed by a voice so weak and raspy it was barely recognizable. Eva. She practically threw herself at the locking mechanism, her fingers slipping on the heavy steel levers in her panic. She threw the deadbolts and pushed with all her might. The bookshelf swung open heavily. Colton collapsed inward, spilling onto the floor of the panic room. His sweater was soaked, a massive, dark stain spreading rapidly from his abdomen. The stitches had torn completely. His face was ghostly pale, his lips tinged with blue. He was clutching his Glock in one hand, but his fingers were slack. "Colton!" Eva screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. He looked up at her, a weak, bloody smile touching his lips. "I told you. I'd come back." His eyes rolled back in his head, and he went entirely limp. "Stay with me." "Do not close your eyes, Colton. Look at me." Eva's voice was a ragged scream in the claustrophobic space of the panic room. The smell of copper and cordite was suffocating. Colton lay on the concrete floor, his breathing shallow and rattling. The trauma of the firefight had completely destroyed the delicate healing of his wound. The laceration had ripped open, and he was hemorrhaging fast. Eva's hands were slick with his blood. The pristine, sterile environment of the hospital clinicals was gone. This was combat medicine. She ripped the ruined sweater off him, exposing the horrific damage. She didn't bother with rubbing alcohol this time. She grabbed a fistful of hemostatic gauze from the emergency kit gauze treated with agents designed to forcefully clot blood and shoved it directly into the open wound. Colton's body violently convulsed, a choked, agonized gasp escaping his throat, but his eyes remained closed. He was slipping into hypovolemic shock. No, you don't get to die now," Eva sobbed, leaning her entire body weight onto her hands, pressing down into his abdomen with brutal force. "You promised you'd get me out of here. You don't get to break a promise, you stubborn bastard. Wake up." Minutes dragged on in pure, adrenaline-fueled terror. She held the pressure until her arms trembled so violently she thought her elbows would snap. Slowly, agonizingly, the dark tide of blood seeping through her fingers began to slow. The hemostatic agents were working. Eva grabbed a roll of heavy compression bandages, wrapping them tightly around his torso, pulling them so taut they dug into his skin. When she was finally finished, she collapsed back against the concrete wall, her chest heaving, her hands stained crimson up to her wrists. Colton lay still, but his chest was rising and falling in a more steady, albeit weak rhythm. The bleeding was controlled. For now. Eva sat beside him for hours in the red glow of the emergency lights, refusing to move, her hand resting over his heart to feel the steady beat. It was well past dawn when Colton finally stirred. He let out a low groan, his eyelids fluttering open. He blinked against the red light, confusion clouding his dark eyes before memory sharpened them into focus. He looked down at the massive, bloody bandages swathing his torso, then turned his head to look at Eva. She was sitting against the wall, her knees pulled to her chest, her face pale and exhausted. "You saved me." Again, he whispered, his voice incredibly weak. "You're making a habit of bleeding out on me," Eva replied, her voice thick with emotion. She crawled over to him, gently checking the edge of the bandages. "The bleeding stopped, but you tore everything open. You need a real hospital, Colton. I can't fix this with gauze and tape." "The syndicate?" he managed to ask. "I haven't heard anything for hours. I think Marcus pushed them back. Or they retreated. But we're locked in here." Colton closed his eyes, letting out a long, shuddering breath. The ruthless facade was entirely stripped away, leaving only a profoundly broken, exhausted man. "I lost too many men tonight," he murmured. "They hit us too hard. The syndicate knows I'm vulnerable. They'll regroup and come back to finish it." He opened his eyes and looked at Eva, his gaze intensely vulnerable. "I'm so tired, Eva. I've been fighting this war in the dark for so long. I thought if I just built a big enough wall I could protect the innocent ones. But the wall is crumbling." Eva reached out, gently taking his cold, blood-stained hand in hers. She didn't care about the dirt or the blood. She only cared about the man who was carrying the weight of the world alone. "You don't have to fight it alone anymore," Eva said fiercely, her voice steady. "You have evidence in that study. You have the ledgers. You have the locations of their holding facilities. You don't have to be the Mafia boss anymore. You can blow the whole thing wide open. You can give it to the feds." Colton let out a bitter, hollow laugh that turned into a cough. "The feds? Half the task force in this city is on the syndicate's payroll. If I hand over that evidence, it will disappear, and I will be quietly assassinated in a holding cell. The only way to destroy them is to cut off the head of the snake myself. And I don't think I have the strength left to hold the sword." He squeezed her hand weakly. "There is a secure laptop in the panel behind you. It has offshore accounts. Clean money. It's untraceable. Marcus has orders to get you out of the city, give you a new identity. You have to leave, Eva. Tonight, before they come back." "No," Eva said instantly, her grip tightening on his hand. Colton frowned, struggling to push himself up on his elbows. "Eva, this isn't a negotiation. You are a civilian. You have a life. You have nursing school. I will not let you die in this concrete tomb because of my failures." "Your failures?" Eva fired back, anger flashing in her eyes. "You sacrificed your entire life to save people you don't even know. You are the only person standing between those monsters and thousands of innocent people. I am not leaving you here to die. I am a nurse. You are my patient. And right now, my patient needs to figure out how to win a war." Colton stared at her, stunned by the fierce, unyielding fire in her eyes. In that dim, bloody panic room, he realized that the girl he had pulled from the diner was not just a survivor. She was a warrior in her own right, and for the first time in 20 years, Colton didn't feel entirely alone in the dark. The heavy steel door of the panic room finally scraped open late into the afternoon. Marcus stood in the threshold, looking like he had walked through hell. His suit was shredded, his face coated in soot and dried blood, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side in a makeshift sling. But his eyes were sharp. "The perimeter is secure, boss," Marcus said, his voice grating with exhaustion. They pulled back to regroup. "We have a window. But it's small." "Colton, leaning heavily against Eva, managed to nod. The painkillers Eva had injected from the emergency kit had brought the agony down to a dull, roaring background noise, giving him a few hours of clarity. Get the servers from the basement. Everything we have on the syndicate, Colton ordered, his voice gaining a fraction of its old authority. We are abandoning the estate. Marcus's eyes widened slightly, a rare show of surprise. Abandoning? Sir, where do we go? We can fortify. No more fortifying. The defensive war is over. Colton cut him off, groaning as he shifted his weight. We go on the offensive, but not the way we used to. He turned his head to look at Eva. She was supporting his weight, her small frame straining, but her face was resolute. She had made her choice, and her quiet strength was the anchor he desperately needed. Eva, Colton said softly, last chance. There is a car waiting at the back gate. It will take you to an airfield. You will vanish. You will be safe. Eva looked at him, her eyes tracing the sharp lines of his face, the exhaustion, the pain, and the underlying nobility that he had hidden from the world for so long. She thought about the diner, the smell of grease, the endless grinding poverty, and the hollow feeling of walking through life without a purpose. Then she thought about the locket, the little girl, the thousands of people who needed the shield Colton had built. I told you, Eva said, her voice steady and unwavering. I'm not leaving. You have a war to finish. And you're going to need someone to patch you up when you do something stupid again. A faint, genuine smile broke through the pain on Colton's face. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking sight. You are incredibly stubborn, woman. I learn from the best. She shot back. With Marcus's help, they managed to get Colton out of the panic room and up into the main house. The estate was a war zone. Shattered glass glittered like diamonds on the blood-stained marble floors. The air smelled of smoke and spent brass. It was the physical manifestation of the violent life Colton had led, a life that was now collapsing around him. They moved to the underground garage, where a heavily armored, unassuming black van was waiting. Marcus loaded heavy duffel bags filled with hard drives, encrypted laptops, and the physical ledgers Eva had found in the study. These bags contained the digital soul of the trafficking syndicate. It was enough to burn their empire to ashes. Where are we taking it? Marcus asked, slamming the back doors of the van shut. If we can't trust the feds, we don't go to the feds, Colton said, leaning against the side of the van as Ava checked his bandages one last time. We go to the media. We go to the international watchdogs. We upload the encrypted files to a decentralized network and broadcast the decryption keys to every major news outlet on the planet simultaneously. We make the truth so loud, so inescapable, that the corrupt politicians and the bot cops can't bury it. We expose everything. Marcus nodded slowly, a fierce grin spreading across his battered face. The nuclear option. I like it, but to do it, we need a secure uplink. We need the servers at the old shipping terminal, Colton said, his brow furrowing in pain. It's syndicate territory now. It's a fortress. If we walk in there, it's a suicide mission. It's not a suicide mission if they don't see us coming. Eva interjected quietly. Both men looked at her. She felt the weight of their stares, but she didn't flinch. She had spent the last 10 hours in a dark room thinking about how to save this man. The syndicate thinks you're a mafia boss, Colton, Eva said, her clinical mind dissecting the problem. They expect you to attack like a mobster. Guns blazing, front door assault. They expect a war of attrition. And what do you suggest, nurse? Colton asked, a spark of genuine curiosity in his eyes. I suggest a Trojan horse, Eva said. They know you were severely wounded. They know you need medical supplies. They have the shipping terminal on lockdown, which means that's where their medical freight comes in. She looked at Marcus. Can you get us an ambulance? A real one. With city municipal plates? Marcus's eyes widened in understanding. I can have one here in 20 minutes. Colton stared at Eva, a profound sense of awe washing over him. This woman, a diner waitress and nursing student, was formulating a tactical breach that his hardened lieutenants hadn't considered. She wasn't just patching his wounds, she was healing the fatal flaws in his strategy. You're a terrifying woman, Eva, Colton murmured, reaching out and brushing his knuckles gently against her cheek. I told you, she whispered, leaning into his touch. I'm not just a waitress anymore. The torrential rain had returned, a poetic echo of the night they had met, turning the streets of the industrial district into slick, black mirrors. The stolen municipal ambulance moved slowly through the deserted roads, its lights dark, blending into the miserable weather. Eva sat in the back, dressed in a stolen paramedic uniform. Her hands were steady, but her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Beside her on the gurney lay Colton. He was deathly pale, hooked up to a saline drip, acting the part of a critically wounded man. Beneath the crisp white sheets, his hands gripped a pair of suppressed submachine guns. Marcus drove, navigating the massive labyrinth of the shipping terminal. Checkpoint ahead. Marcus's voice crackled through the comms piece in Ava's ear. Stay calm. Let me do the talking. The ambulance rolled to a stop beneath a harsh halogen floodlight. Eva could see two heavily armed syndicate guards step out of a guardhouse, assault rifles raised. The rain hammered against the roof of the ambulance. Marcus rolled down the window. City dispatch, he shouted over the rain, flashing a forged badge. We got a call for a severe trauma. Guy got crushed by a forklift in Sector 4. We need immediate access. The guard peered suspiciously through the windshield. He walked around to the back of the ambulance and banged his fist against the rear doors. Open it up. Let me see. Eva took a deep breath, praying her hands wouldn't shake. She pushed the rear doors open. The guard shone a blinding flashlight into the back. It illuminated Eva in her paramedic gear, looking frantic, and Colton on the gurney, his face pale, an oxygen mask over his mouth, and a massive bloody bandage covering his chest. He's coding! Eva screamed, injecting pure panic into her voice. He's bleeding out internally. I need to get him stabilized. Get the hell out of my way, or he dies right here on your dock. The guard, faced with a screaming medical professional and a dying man, hesitated. The primal human aversion to interfering with a medical emergency kicked in. He clicked his radio. Let him through. Sector 4. The doors slammed shut. The ambulance lurched forward. Eva let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for an hour. Colton pulled the oxygen mask down, a grim smile on his face. Brilliant performance, he whispered. Don't make me laugh, I might puke, Eva muttered, leaning against the wall of the ambulance. They navigated deep into the heart of the terminal, pulling into an abandoned loading bay adjacent to the main server hub. Marcus killed the engine. The quiet was immediate and tense. We have 10 minutes before they realized there was no forklift accident in Sector 4, Marcus said, racking the slide of his rifle. We move fast. Colton sat up, biting back a groan of pain. He threw off the sheets, gripping his weapons. He looked at Eva. You stay in the rig. Keep the engine running. If we aren't back in 15 minutes, you drive. You don't look back. Colton, promise me, Eva. He demanded, his eyes locking with hers in the dim light of the cabin. I promise, she choked out. He leaned forward, ignoring the searing pain in his abdomen, and kissed her. It was a desperate, fierce collision of fear and hope. It tasted of rain and blood, and the promise of a future they were fighting to carve out of the darkness. I'll be right back, he murmured against her lips. He and Marcus slipped out the back doors, melting into the shadows of the warehouse. Eva scrambled into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. The next 12 minutes were the longest of her life. She watched the digital clock on the dashboard tick forward with agonizing slowness. She heard muffled shouts, the suppressed fut-fut-fut of gunfire, and the distant wail of alarms. She kept her foot hovering over the gas pedal, tears streaming down her face, praying with every fiber of her being. At exactly 14 minutes, the warehouse doors burst open. Marcus sprinted out, providing cover fire into the darkness. A moment later, Colton emerged, limping heavily, clutching a heavy black hard drive to his chest. Go, 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 Marcus roared, throwing himself into the passenger seat as Colton dove into the back of the ambulance. Eva slammed her foot on the gas. The heavy vehicle fishtailed wildly on the wet pavement before catching traction and tearing out of the loading bay. Gunfire erupted behind them, bullets pinging off the reinforced rear doors. But they were already moving too fast. Eva expertly navigated the labyrinth of containers, smashing through the outer gate and rocketing into the dark, rain-slicked city streets. In the back, Colton lay on the floor, gasping for air. The hard drive clutched triumphantly in his hands. He looked up at the ceiling of the bouncing ambulance and let out a breathless, echoing laugh. "Did we get it?" Eva yelled over her shoulder, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "We got it," Colton yelled back, his voice thick with exhausted victory. "The upload is triggered. Every news agency in the world gets the decryption key in 5 minutes. It's over, Eva. The syndicate is dead." As they drove out of the city limits, leaving the flashing lights and the burning sirens far behind them, the heavy, oppressive weight that had suffocated Colton for 20 years finally lifted. The rain stopped, and a faint, pale line of dawn began to crack over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. Eva pulled the ambulance over on a quiet, deserted stretch of highway. She climbed into the back. Colton was sitting up, leaning against the wall. He looked battered, bleeding, and entirely exhausted, but his eyes were clear. The shadows were gone. "So," Eva said softly, kneeling in front of him, "what happens now to the terrifying Mafia boss?" Colton looked at her, reaching out to gently trace the line of her jaw. "He died in that warehouse tonight. He doesn't exist anymore." He pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "But the man who lived, he has a lot of making up to do. And he's going to need a very good nurse to keep him out of trouble." Eva smiled, tears finally spilling over her cheeks as she buried her face in his neck. They were broken, battered, and bleeding, but as the sun broke over the horizon, casting its warm golden light into the back of the stolen ambulance, they were finally, truly free. The scars of the past cannot be erased, but they do not have to dictate the future. Sometimes, the monsters we fear the most are just broken souls desperately trying to build a shield for others in the dark. True strength isn't found in ruling an empire with fear, but in the courage to dismantle it for the sake of the innocent, and in the vulnerability to let someone heal the wounds you cannot reach yourself. If this story of redemption, hidden truths, and the healing power of love resonated with you, please hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more immersive, cinematic stories. Your support helps bring these characters to life.